I'd like to speak to you tonight about T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, and the Christian imagination. I've written a good deal on these things, and there are some people even here in the room who've heard me speak about them before. One of my very brilliant former students is here, who's now himself a professor tonight. I'm very pleased that he has come along. T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis were men of profoundly different temperaments and literary sensibilities, and they may be said to be the two greatest orthodox Christian English language writers of the 20th century, writers whose works repay close and repeated study. Yet their differences deserve notice and description. Born in 1888 in St. Louis and educated at Harvard and then intermittently on the continent and in England, Eliot was both a Midwesterner and a Boston Brahmin. Yet he came in his lifetime as close to comprehending and representing the ideal mind of Western civilization as men such as Johnson, Bach, Shakespeare, or Michelangelo did. He reached this status, an artistic and cultural potency and importance greater than any American before or since, without at first displaying the heroic nobility and virtue that one associates with each of the artists I just mentioned. He reached it by a circuitous ascent from the agonizing experience of confronting the absurdity of modern life, more fully, courageously, and successfully than any writer before him, I think. Eliot's intense privacy, urbanity, and sophistication were eventually transformed by a peculiarly lonely, heroic pursuit of sanctity that made him both one of the most hated and one of the most admired men in the world of 20th century high culture. Born 10 years later, in 1898, in Northern Ireland, C.S. Lewis was a younger man who nevertheless was more rooted in the tradition of Victorian literature, taste, and opinion than was Eliot. He despised the modern movement in literature that Eliot represented and did much to promote. Never close to Eliot, for years Lewis disliked and mocked his work. A hearty, outgoing man who served and was badly wounded in World War I, Lewis was romantic in temperament and traditional in his literary sensibility. He loved Spenser and Milton and Wordsworth, and he was the close friend of that other great Christian Platonist fabulist, J.R.R. Tolkien, the 20th century's most popular writer by quite a long shot. Different then in generation, nationality, temperament, and sensibility, and never personally close to one another, what did these two men have, or what did they come to have in common? To me, three things stand out. Both were trained and talented philosophers. Both were decisively affected by the Great War of 1914-1918, which we later came to call World War I. And both rejected the Whig interpretation of history, the extraordinarily pervasive modern ideology that conveyed the sense that the human project was on an arc of improvement that was collective, cumulative, inevitable, and irreversible, and that its emancipatory impetus was comprised of science, technology, and liberal humanism. For example, the émigré German-Jewish philosopher Leo Strauss has written, quote, "The idea of progress in the modern sense implies that once man has reached a certain level, that is, the human experience has reached a certain level, human civilization, human striving and effort, that once man has reached a certain level, intellectual and social or moral, there exists a firm level of being below which he cannot sink again. This contention, however," Strauss goes on, "is empirically refuted by the incredible barbarization which we have been so unfortunate as to witness in our century," end quote. And Strauss should have known, because he was a refugee from Nazi Germany who came to teach in this country in the late 1940s after being in Britain for a while. In the midst of this barbarization, in the mid-1930s, Eliot was to reproach secular humanist progressives in a passage that has become justly famous, from Chorus 6 from The Rock. Quote, They constantly try to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. But the man that is will shadow the man that pretends to be. End quote. Highly, deeply, and brilliantly trained in the very last efflorescence of 19th century Platonist and Hegelian idealism, Eliot at Harvard and Lewis at Oxford, both men passed away from it, but they were equipped or armed by philosophy with the intellectual ballast, perspective, insight, and instruments that served them well in discerning the varieties of modern heresy that they confronted during their lifetimes. The Great War of 1914-1918 affected both men intensely. Lewis was almost fatally wounded at Arras in 1918, and Eliot saw in its destructiveness a final proof of the falsity of the modern secularizing optimism I have just mentioned, which had been promoted by Bacon at the beginning of the 17th century and had grown, especially by way of 18th century France, steadily in propagandistic power and appeal down to 1914. Progress had gradually replaced providence as a governing assumption, and hubris and aggression had replaced humility and gratitude. Instead of reaching utopia, modern civilization in 1920 was in many ways a wasteland, title of Eliot's first and perhaps his greatest single poem. A wasteland, a broken down land, Dante's Paese Guasto, our word waste related to guasto, waste in Italian, Paese Guasto, a broken down land, the kind of land that Dante depicts also in certain passages of the Inferno, passages that haunted Eliot. I just gave a lecture in Italy on Eliot in Italian about 2 years ago, and I expected about 30 to 50 people would come to the lecture, and there were 500 people came to the lecture, and you could have heard a pin drop, and they were quite aware of Eliot's work. The questions in the session afterwards were astonishing. Astonishing. 500 people, couldn't believe it. He's very widely read in Italy and generally on the continent. The broken down land, the wasteland, is an image of a military, industrial, commercial, ideological inferno or madhouse, which is what Europe looked like in 1920, especially the further east you went. And Eliot, as a world historical poet, wrote about that world. Eliot confronted modern absurdity and nausea in literary ways that Lewis never did. A world historical poet, Eliot evoked the chaotic destructiveness of World War I and its revolutionary aftermath in passages of clairvoyant, hallucinatory poetic power. For example, what is that sound high in the air? Murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth? That's from The Wasteland. The murmur of maternal lamentation. Beautiful onomatopoetic passage. Murmur of maternal lamentation. Not only expresses the weeping of women all over Europe in 1920 for their 13 million dead sons, husbands, and brothers, and foreshadows the many millions more to come in succeeding decades. It also expresses a note of profound Orthodox Catholic Christian piety, evoking the Stabat Mater Dolorosa, weeping at the foot of the cross, evoking the Pietà itself, murmur of maternal lamentation. This note of profound Orthodox Catholic Christian piety would become a decisive mark of Eliot's mature convictions and character. The experience of war and absurdity proved to Eliot and Lewis that there was no such thing as inevitable and irreversible human progress. Yet neither man became a cynic or an absurdist or an atheistic existentialist or an ideological revolutionary of the left or right, or an aesthete, as almost all of their intellectual or artistic contemporaries did. It's very sobering to read the history of intellectual loyalties in the 20th century from 1914 to the present. It's a vast spectacle of a treason of intellectuals, trahison d'éclair. How many people have worshipped and admired Lenin or Stalin or Mussolini or Hitler or some fanatic, or who have been simply nihilistic aesthetes, interested in immediate pleasure or immediate impact of an aesthetic kind. Neither of these men chose any of these options. Light is shed on their achievement by a recent statement by a great philosophical Christian poet of our own time, our own moment, Czesław Miłosz, a Pole who won the Nobel Prize in 1980, has lived and worked in Warsaw, Paris, and Berkeley, and has witnessed many of the idiocies, horrors, and deformities of our time firsthand. Nazism, communism, consumerist nihilism. Quote, "The intellectual baggage of artists today, regardless of nationality, is more or less the same everywhere," Miłosz has written. "All are children of the age, and consciously or unconsciously, all pay homage to the nihilistic canon of the day." End quote. Eliot and Lewis came to understand this brutal, blatant bow, what Ruskin on his way to madness had seen in the late 19th century as, quote, "the modern infidel imagination, amusing itself with destruction of the body and busying itself with aberration of the mind," end quote. Like Chesterton, whom both came to venerate, they saw in modern nihilism, in whoring after strange gods, the black fruit of a scientistic culture that had denied natural and theological first principles and was reaping a diabolical harvest. This harvesting is still with us, and our contemporary history is an oscillation between its chronic and its acute phases. I think that Eliot and Lewis knew that hope is not optimism, that hope is a theological virtue, requiring exertion, courage, and clear sight. In Kipling's words, they kept their heads when all around them were losing theirs. We know that Eliot kept a signed photograph of Pope Pius XII on his desk at Faber and Faber in London. We know that the present Pope and Cardinal Ratzinger read and admire Lewis's works. Lewis's love and praise of figures such as Richard Hooker was the praise of the classical Christian humanism of the Middle Ages, whose greatest spokesman was St. Thomas Aquinas. At the end of Lewis's brilliant, profound dystopian science fiction satirical novel, That Hideous Strength, he has his Christian magus spokesman, Merlin, point the lesson that from 1920 on, Eliot never stopped repeating in one form or another. Qui verbum Dei contempserunt, eius aeferetur etiam verbum homines. They that have despised the word of God, from them shall the word of man also be taken away. A more philosophical way of putting this is to say with the Oxford Catholic philosopher Michael Dummett that there is no satisfactory account of truth or ethics without theism. They that have despised the word of God, from them shall the word of man also be taken away. From the Tower of Babel and the city of Sodom to the linguistic and visual inanities, insanities, and obscenities of our contemporary culture, high and low, virulent human folly, vice, and sin are impossible for the wise and pious person not to see and suffer from. They now afflict, disorient, and sometimes destroy our children. They now pollute the fresh and beautiful earth with unprecedented power and drown with noise and profanity the courtesies and sonorities of nature, music, and liturgy. In this milieu, the baptized imaginations of Eliot and Lewis, profoundly different as they are in genre, tone, and sensibility, provide sources of solace, succor, solicitude, and renewal, saving remnants. They comprise a fundamental antidote to the nihilistic canon Miłosz identified as so nearly universal in our toxic and trivial culture. Somewhere in the writings of Jacquetta Hawkes, she remarks that at a certain level of high seriousness or high perceptiveness, of felt human anguish or joy, literature moves inevitably towards theology. Words overcome gravity to be drawn by the grace of the Word. All true goods hearken to the good. Eliot said that in his four quartets, his great poems of the late 30s and early 40s, he tried to catch something he had intermittently heard in Beethoven, something almost unspeakably gracious and poignant. Lewis's prose is full of breathtaking epiphanies of human understanding that light up the horizon with radiant goodness and truth, and by so doing, revive in us the image of God. Words call us into being as humans. The Word calls us into being as Christians. Thus, the fate of literature can never be negligible to Christians. 70 years ago, the non-Christian critic F.R. Leavis, a very good critic of Eliot, critic in the sense of someone who appreciates and comments on someone's work. 70 years ago, the non-Christian critic F.R. Leavis argued that Eliot's poem Ash Wednesday, quote, has a ritualistic quality which establishes, apart from the world, a special order of experience dedicated to spiritual exercises, end quote. And more recently, the Catholic critic Dennis Donahue has argued that this is true of nearly all of Eliot's poems. They establish, apart from the world of a special order of experience dedicated to spiritual exercises. Never has the linguistic milieu been so fundamentally depraved and polluted as in our time. Thus, the infinite value of those writers who confronted darkness, perversion, and pandemonium, and rescue anew the sense of sound, the sound of sense, who make the word heard. Let me conclude with one passage from Eliot, and then I'd be very happy to take any questions that might help us to initiate some conversation. In East Coker, section 5, which is one of the four quartets, the great late poems of Eliot, Kenneth Muir has argued that they are the greatest poems of the 20th century, and I think that's plausible. I don't know of too many poems that would rival them in this respect. In the great fifth section of East Coker, Eliot writes this: and so each venture is a new beginning, arrayed on the inarticulate with shabby equipment always deteriorating, in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion. And what there is to conquer by strength and submission has already been discovered once or twice or several times by men whom one cannot hope to emulate, but there is no competition. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again, and now under conditions that seem unpropitious. But perhaps neither gain nor loss. For us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. Thank you.